Bill's not going to jump on, I assume, so we'll just get started then.
Yep. So yeah, everyone, welcome to April office hours. And yeah, today's topic is Ben going through Gateway 11.1 preview. So take it away, Ben.
Thank you. Right. Well, welcome to the call today, guys. We got a lot of content to cover in 1 hour. I delivered a internal training on all of these same topics with a little bit more detail just the other day, and it took a little over 2 hours. So we're going to keep it higher level just so you get an idea of what's coming, but feel free to interrupt with questions, comments. Try to leave time at the end if we just don't go right up to the very end. And let's get started to talk about what's coming out on 11.1, currently scheduled to be released next Tuesday. And we are on track for that, but you know, anything could happen. So we might slip a day or two if something throws a wrench into the works, but right now we don't expect that. So these are the highlights. We're going to cover each of these in order. And then near the end, we'll talk about a few deprecations we're announcing. We'll talk about upgrade paths across different gateway form factors from 10x to 11.1 or 11 to 11.1. And then there's just a few other things to mention at the very end. So first, one of the big rocks we moved for this new major release of the gateway was upgrading it from Debian, upgrading the appliance gateways from Debian 11 to Debian 12. You'll remember we moved from CentOS 7 to Debian 11 when going from 10.1 to 11. And that was a big rock to move. This next major release goes to the next major version of the Debian operating system. One reason we did that was to make sure that this next version of the gateway is using an operating system that will last throughout its lifetime. And then, you know, just in keeping with upgrading operating systems, libraries, what have you, routinely, you know, to improve reliability and security of the gateway in general. This release will have a new 11.1 OVA that's already on Debian 12 for new virtual appliance deployments. It will not include an ISO to upgrade hardware appliances to Debian 12. And that's because this is the first major release of the gateway that's made a major operating system change that's going to support an in-place upgrade, which was one of the promises of moving from CentOS to Debian. And so this is the first time we get to fulfill that promise. So we're pretty excited about that. Now, if you're already on Gateway 11.0, you'll be able to do an in-place upgrade to Gateway 11.1. We still support the manual expedited upgrade, even going from 11 to 11.1. It's required to get from 10x to 11x. But again, it's good news that now we do support an in-place upgrade. For those of you that are already upgraded to 11.0, you don't have to stand up a new environment on 11.1 appliances and migrate your data to them like the expedited manual upgrade process would have you do. You can choose to do an in-place upgrade of your existing appliances. This is a representation of that upgrade process. It begins with understanding, completing a number of prerequisites, first and foremost of which is to make sure that your 11.0 gateways have had the latest MPP applied to them. That's important because that'll address several requirements for the in-place upgrade from 11 to 11.1. We also are recommending that you apply persistent volume labels to the boot partition in your 11.0 appliances. They didn't ship with those persistent volume labels applied. They cause known issues with rebooting appliance gateways. So we recommend that you do this now because you may have already noticed that there's several reboots required across this multi-step in-place upgrade process. Unfortunately, those are unavoidable. We determined that those reboots that are required are necessary to successfully upgrade from step to step. We definitely had an eye out for avoiding reboots as much as possible, but it is what it is. We're upgrading the operating system, then the gateway, then the database. There's a lot going on there with a lot of interdependencies, a lot of which require restarts to be properly in place before the next thing can be done. Making sure that you have adequate disk space is also very important. We'll get into the there will be more details about that included with the documentation. Like usual, we're always going to recommend a full system backup, but it's probably more important in this case if you upgrade in place, because you won't have those old gateways to go back to, right? You're going to be upgrading them in place. If anything goes wrong, you're going to want a full system backup to revert to if necessary. We are introducing a readiness checker script that we strongly recommend you execute at least once in each environment that has like configured gateways, because it will check for a number of these prerequisites and more. So it's a useful tool. We recommend that you run it and you mitigate any of the issues it finds. We also just recommend reading the documentation before you go ahead and do the in-place upgrade. And part of that documentation is going to include a handful of known issues and troubleshooting tips related to the in-place upgrade specifically. Some of those things are caught out in this short list. Some of those things are checked for by this readiness checker script. But, you know, some of these things you're just going to want to be aware of. They're edge cases. They're not going to apply to everybody, but you want to go into this fully informed. Once you've understood and completed the prerequisites, you'll apply the Debian upgrade patch, and this will upgrade the appliance from Debian 11 to Debian 12. You need to do a reboot after applying that patch when the gateway comes back up. The gateway and its database will still be on 11.0, but the operating system will be Debian 12. You'll then apply the gateway upgrade patch and then perform another reboot. And when the gateway comes back up, now the gateway will be on 11.1. but the database will still be on 11.0. We were going to release an update to the single sign-on SDK with 11.1, but we held it back because we found some issues with it late in the release process. So we're going to address those in our next PI and deliver that for 11.1 CR1. So when you actually do your upgrade, if that's available, then this is when you would apply that during the in-place upgrade step. I'm sorry. And then lastly, you're going to upgrade your database. Now, before you do that, you want to stop database replication, upgrade the database to the SSG config menu. A reboot is optional here, not required. But after upgrading the database, then you do need to restart your database replication. After that, that gateway will be upgraded. That database upgrade step, if you're upgrading a cluster, you want to perform all of these steps on every node in the cluster, beginning with the primary node. You can skip the database upgrade on all the other nodes of the cluster, because after upgrading the primary node and restarting replication, replication should upgrade your secondary database, and your other non-database nodes wouldn't need to upgrade the database either. There are a handful of post-upgrade considerations, not listed here, but listed in our documentation. We do strongly recommend that you apply the latest 11.1 patch, MPP, after completing your upgrade, in-place upgrade to 11.1, especially depending on when you do that upgrade. Even if you upgrade as soon as this is available as GA, you're still going to want to apply the April MPP for 11.1 that's coming out at nearly the same time. And that's because there are some, upgrades in it, and in particular of MySQL to be Debian 12 compatible that were not available when we, when we went into code freeze for release hardening of the 11.1 release. They got into the MPP after that. Your 11.1 gateway will still work on the version of MySQL that was applied with the latest 11.0 MPP, but that version's not technically Debian 12 compatible. To get the Debian 12 compatible version of MySQL, you do need to apply the latest 11.1 MPP. Any questions about that before we move on? Okay. Then the next major upgrade we did in 11.1 was from JDK 11 to JDK 17, again, to improve reliability and security. Nicely, this comes with a performance improvement too. Now, during our own control testing, we saw garbage collection be about 15% faster on JDK 17 than 11. And that also contributed to an overall 13% improvement in throughput and a 12% improvement in average response times. Of course, your mileage might vary. I've also seen some industry benchmarks saying that garbage collection in JDK 17 is 8% faster than JDK 11. So our results varied positively. Your results will almost certainly vary. However, in any case, when you consider that our performance delta from release to release is, on average plus or even minus 1%, so we're relatively stable when it comes to performance over many of our last releases, these are significant sustained improvements. Now, with upgrading to JDK 17, we upgraded many of the libraries to be compatible with JDK 17. At least one of those was a Bouncy Castle library that we use for some of the crypto in the gateway. As a part of that, some weak elliptic curve algorithms were removed. They'll be listed in the documentation. And some other weak algorithms have been removed from the default cipher sets used by listeners and route assertions. However, those are still there if users need to select them again. That change will apply immediately to default cipher sets of listeners and route assertions created by you if you have not already customized those cipher sets, in which case we'll be, tracking a custom cipher set for that listener or route assertion in the database. And so you'll want to inspect those things to see, if this is going to have an impact on you and the consumers of your services. And if so, you can go back into those and reselect some of those weak algorithms if necessary. Now, the JDK 17 upgrade will also require upgrading Luna and Enshield HSM clients that some of you may be using. There's separate processes for upgrading those. Those will not be upgraded with an in-place upgrade. So even if you were to perform the in-place upgrade, if you're using Luna or Enshield, you would have to, go ahead and upgrade those after the in-place upgrade to later versions that are also JDK 17 compatible. Now, we always recommend that you use the same version of Policy Manager as the version of gateway you're connecting to. However, we know that often you can use older versions of Policy Manager with newer versions of gateways, and it'll allow you to connect, and at most, you won't be able to see and do some of the new things that are exposed in a later version of Policy Manager. With this release, it's even more important that you're using the right versions together, and especially because of the JDK update. Any questions on this before we move on? Okay. Then the next update we did was to update our support for a later version of vSphere ESXi to 8. Previously, with the 11.0 release, we were supporting just ESXi 7 and virtual hardware version 17, which was required by the VMware compatibility matrix for the Debian 11 operating system. That was included with 11.0. We did have customers that were still on the long end of life ESXi 6.5 or 6.7 versions. We were not able to back support 11.0 to those older ESXi versions. But even though Debian 12 technically requires ESXi 8 and virtual hardware version 20 or later, we do know that 11.1 with Debian 12 will work on ESXi 7 with virtual hardware version 17. And so we will back support, if you will, 11.1 on ESXi 7. Now, there's still going to be a discrepancy in the vSphere/ESXi UI when you go to deploy a 11.1 gateway running Debian 12. It's going to tell you that the guest OS of the gateway you deployed is Debian 11 and, you know, on virtual hardware version 17. We have to specify that in order for you to be able to run it in ESXi 7, even if in fact the virtual appliance is running Debian 12. Any questions about that? Okay. Now to possibly a couple more exciting features. Even while many of our customers are moving to more aggressive cloud-native deployments with container.
Hi, Ben. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Would you mind taking a look at the questions in the chat when you can? It would be helpful for me to utilize my time as well. I'm specifically looking for some content on the container-based API gateway. I'm just wondering if you are able to cover today so that I can decide to utilize my time here.
Yes. Everything I'm covering is everything that's in 11.1, much of which applies to all gateway form factors, hardware and virtual appliances, software, and container.
Got it. Sure. Thank you.
So yes, some of this is very relevant to container gateway customers too.
Got it. Thank you. That's what I was looking for. Thanks.
You bet. And I don't generally keep an eye on the chat because I forget to.
That's totally fine. That's what I have realized.
Yeah,
I've realized that. That's okay. That's why I have interrupted you. It's totally fine.
You can interrupt, and everybody else can interrupt too. And if someone does put something in the chat and they just want to direct me to that, do exactly what Gopi did. That was perfect.
Thank you.
So this and the next feature do apply to all gateway form factors, though I'm sure customers that decide to use one of these next two features may be less likely to be running the container gateway. And that's because, like I said, while a lot of our customers are starting to lead in the more aggressive cloud-native deployments of our container gateway in Kubernetes, including the ephemeral container gateway, so running gateways without a database, or at least a MySQL-backed database cluster of gateways, and instead probably driving those gateways with configuration as code in the form of possibly RESTmin, but probably today GraphMan bundles. We've nonetheless gone out of our way to also support a variety of MySQL alternatives for the gateway's MySQL database for those customers still using it in the cloud with MySQL compatible database services, which we addressed in earlier releases. And now we're giving you some self-managed MySQL alternative options that you could deploy and use with your gateways regardless of where they're deployed, but also especially if they're still on-prem. And one of those is MySQL Enterprise with additional support for group replication. That group replication then is an alternative to the master replication that we have been supporting with the MySQL standard that we've included with our appliance gateways. Now, group replication can be configured in two modes, single primary mode and multi-primary mode. In our case, we're only supporting the single primary mode of, group replication. To support group replication, we did need to add additional primary keys to some of our gateway database tables that were missing those. Now, we only did that, and technically we're only supporting this MySQL alternative for the gateway. These changes do not yet include the OTK, MAG, or portal databases. And we expect you to connect to MySQL Enterprise with group replication through an intelligent proxy that's going to handle the failover across that deployment for us. And those proxies could be MySQL Router, which comes with MySQL Enterprise, or HA Proxy, which is, I believe open source, and it's available to be used not just with MySQL Enterprise, but also with the next MySQL alternative database that we're going to cover on the next slide. We're not providing you with MySQL Enterprise or the proxy that you would need to deploy in front of it that we'll connect to. That's on you. You have to license, deploy, and manage MySQL Enterprise, with or without group replication. That's up to you, with a proxy of your choice, properly configured in front of MySQL Enterprise to handle the failover to us. We'll connect to that proxy as the primary database of your gateways. We won't use a secondary because we're going to rely on the high availability of your proxy, and we're going to rely on it to provide high availability to MySQL Enterprise behind it. But what we will do is support you as a gateway customer if you open support cases, even if your gateways are now using this for their MySQL database. The next self-managed MySQL database alternative is Percona ExtraDB clusters. Now, we've actually had some customers using this for a while now, very happily, but in non-strict mode, because strict mode for Percona ExtraDB clusters requires the primary key in all of the database tables. We've added that in order to support MySQL Enterprise with group replication. So by extension, now we're going to officially support Percona ExtraDB clusters where we didn't officially support it before, but we'll also support strict mode because now all the tables have the primary keys that strict mode requires. Percona ExtraDB clusters works on top of Galera clusters. Again, we expect to connect to Percona ExtraDB clusters through a proxy. Percona ExtraDB clusters themselves tend to point to HA proxy for that purpose, and then that proxy would handle the failover. Just like with MySQL Enterprise and the proxy you deploy in front of it, we're not giving you Percona ExtraDB clusters or the proxy you deploy in front of it. That's something that you have to deploy, manage yourself. We would connect to the proxy to connect to PXC. Unlike MySQL Enterprise, Percona ExtraDB clusters, I believe, is open source, available for free, but there is optional support for it if you require support for a database like this in your production environments. Okay, now we get to a list of progressive delivery model features that we are releasing as or advanced to preview in the 11.1 release. That was one of the big themes for this release, was to take some of the higher profile progressive delivery features that we have been working on over the last year and a half, many of which were first introduced as experimental, and advance most of the remaining of them to preview, so that most of all of the gateway related progressive delivery features introduced over the last year and a half are available now as preview in 11.1. Why is a preview important? Because preview includes them out of the box for everybody to preview. Because they're available out of the box, we are going to provide tech docs for those preview features. If you're just previewing those features, then we're recommending you only do that in a non-production environment, and they're only going to be supported through the community portal or with direct relationships you may have with me, for example. However, In most cases, once a progressive delivery feature has reached its preview stage, we're in a position to offer full Broadcom support to a short list of customers that want to use those previews in their production environments and request approval from us by opening a Broadcom support case and have that request approved. So once you see a feature's preview, if you like it, you play with it, it does what you want it to do, and you want to go to production with it right away, open that, and you require Broadcom support for that. Some of you won't, depending on the feature. You're just fine with going to production. Go for it. But if you require Broadcom support for that, then open that Broadcom support case. We'll have a conversation, and as likely as not, you'll get approved. And we'll be tracking you as a customer that we've approved support for that preview feature for. So when you open support cases, you shouldn't be redirected to the community. And the more of you that do that, and the more feedback we get from you, the more that will influence the feature as we, enhance it if need be, but then prioritize it to move from preview to GA on the backline. So one of the big high-profile preview features that a lot of people have been very excited about since last year already is support for OpenTelemetry, which is a industry standard observability framework that supports creating and managing telemetry in the form of metrics, traces, and logs. We are adding support for that to our gateway so that we can emit metrics, traces, and logs in an OpenTelemetry compatible way. The nice thing is that makes it easy to drop us into an already OpenTelemetry compatible environment where you might have one or many other vendor solutions that support OpenTelemetry themselves that you would prefer to use to look at metrics, traces, and logs for monitoring, alerting, and analytics. And if I were to click on this vendor's link, in fact, I'll just go ahead and do it. Why not? It'll take us to a page maintained by the OpenTelemetry project, which lists a whole bunch of vendors that themselves claim to support OpenTelemetry. And so you probably recognize many different vendor solutions in this list. Many of our existing gateway customers already use many of these different solutions. Often that requires them to install proprietary agents on their gateways to push some, maybe not all of this same information to those solutions in more proprietary ways. OpenTelemetry is going to make all of that easier. Now, some of these solutions just support metrics, others just support traces, others just support logs. Some of them support all three of those things. And one nice advantage of OpenTelemetry is that it also supports correlating metrics, traces, and logs together to make using them together more useful. Because it's a standard, there's a specification, there's a protocol for communicating this telemetry between components. There's semantics that govern the format that these things should be in. That's what makes it easy for all of us to support it and then plug, such that we can plug and play with each other nicely. From a gateway perspective, out of the, we're including the OTel SDK. And that's all we're using to provide out-of-the-box OpenTelemetry capabilities for gateway-specific metrics, traces, and logs. We are not including or technically supporting, but we are providing some guidance on how to install and configure the OpenTelemetry agent, which can be deployed together with your gateways inside of your appliance operating systems on the host you've installed your software gateway to, as a sidecar to your container gateway. And then it's able to automatically instrument a lot more of the tech stack that the gateway's running on. So that then it becomes responsible for instrumenting those libraries, packages, other components in that tech stack, so such that they start emitting metrics, traces, and logs, all of which can be correlated back to what the gateway's emitting, giving you a wealth of more information. We are also not giving you the OpenTelemetry collector, but we are requiring that you deploy the OpenTelemetry collector because that is what we're going to connect to with our SDK to emit metrics and traces. We are injecting trace context into logs, but we're not using the SDK to emit them directly to the collector. We're emitting them in all the ways we normally would. And then you're responsible using the collector, because that's an option, or other industry standard components, of which there are many, and many of you are already using, for moving those logs to your backends that then could correlate logs back to traces, back to metrics based on OpenTelemetry. Out of the box, we're providing a number of service metrics when metrics are enabled, but we also are including a telemetry metric assertion that you could use in policy to create custom metrics. I'll talk more about those as we get to metrics.
Ben, I have one question on that. If you don't mind,
Yeah.
can you please go back to the previous screen?
Sure.
So as of now, what we are doing is we have Sumo Logic collector, and we have included the necessary configuration changes. We worked with our tools team who manages the Sumo Logic in our environment, and they had provided the respective JDK and the endpoint, etc. So some of the data goes to the collector, and eventually the log, the Sumo where we log into Sumo Logic to view the metrics. So with that setup, is there any improvement that we could do with whatever the new feature that you are providing here? Maybe we could leverage the assertion itself to do that, or the SDK. I'm just trying to understand if there is any opportunity for us to do it better than what we are already doing.
Almost certainly. However,
Okay.
first understand that what we deliver is disabled by default, so it's not going to break anything you've already done.
Yeah.
However, if you enable more of what we deliver, then almost certainly you'll be able to get additional information that you were not getting into Sumo Logic or other tools like it that you also have.
Okay.
I wouldn't necessarily confuse Sumo Logic's collector with an OpenTelemetry collector unless it also is one. I don't know enough about Sumo Logic.
Sure, it is one of them as well. Yeah.
Okay. And then did you deploy an OpenTelemetry agent or a Sumo Logic agent on your gateways in order to push information to its collector?
Yeah, it is an agentless solution. We do have a container-based API gateway itself. So we have not installed any agents within that container, but there is an SDK that we have configured and deployed the necessary jar files within that while building that container. The jar is the jar is provided by Sumo Logic again. So it would try to get the necessary metrics from API gateway and then push it to the collector. There is an endpoint that we have configured.
So at most, it's probably just getting, container operating system, maybe JVM level metrics.
Yeah,
it
that's
wouldn't
right.
be getting service metrics. It wouldn't be
May not be.
tracing
Yeah.
services all the way down to the assertion level. It wouldn't be getting trace context injected into logs, but it might be getting logs from the console output. So there's things it probably is getting, but there's also things that you could get on top of that now with OpenTelemetry.
Got it. Sure. Thank you.
You bet. So these are the gateway service metrics I'm talking about. These all should be familiar to you. They're the same metrics you would see in the Policy Manager dashboard. We'll automatically emit these if service metrics are enabled, if OTel is enabled, and on top of that, service metrics are enabled. There's several ways of configuring support for OpenTelemetry, from Java arguments or system properties that you would configure to be read on startup, to cluster-wide properties that could enable and disable OpenTelemetry altogether, or aspects of OpenTelemetry. OpenTelemetry has to be enabled, service metrics have to be enabled, and then you'll be getting these metrics. Metrics can have attributes attached to them. Attributes become labels of those metrics, can be used in your downstream systems to search and filter based upon labels. These are the attributes we're automatically attaching to these metrics. Here's an example of a dashboard in Grafana that is being driven by these metrics and metrics being emitted by the telemetry metric assertion that we're also including in 11.1. So the previous metrics are automatic if enabled, providing service metrics without requiring you to instrument any policies. However, if you want to start collecting your own custom metrics in policy, then you can do that using this assertion. It supports these different types of counters. Counter is always counting up, down counter can go up and down. Gauge is a measure at a point in time. Think of it as a temperature gauge, right? What is the temperature now? What is the temperature, every time I check it? Histogram is a measure within a duration of time. When it comes to counters, they get reset when the gateway restarts. That's actually expected. And OpenTelemetry sends enough information with those counters that your backends should be able to recognize that, and they should be able to handle it by aggregating counters across resets during a specific duration. So if you are emitting counter metrics to your backend and you're suddenly seeing them drop to 0 and go back up and drop to 0, probably because your gateways are restarting, and probably because you haven't configured your backend properly to recognize resets within a period of time and aggregate counts across them like is expected for OpenTelemetry in your backends. And just like we're attaching attributes to the service metrics we're emitting, this assertion also lets you attach attributes. One little warning is you want to avoid attribute values that have high cardinality, like a timestamp, something that's its values changing every time the attributes applied to the same counter. That can create real big problems for the way most backends store this kind of data. Another telemetry that can be emitted by OpenTelemetry is traces. This is super powerful. It's probably the most exciting part of OpenTelemetry, really. It's similar to the traces you would get in our precision API monitoring with our productized integration between the gateway and APM. But now you're getting the same thing with OpenTelemetry. You're able to, if OpenTelemetry is enabled and you enable tracing specifically, and you've configured your trace filtering to include we'll get to that in a bit, then you're able to collect traces for, service policy insertion, assertion level transaction data. You also can optionally track the changing values of context variables across that trace. And we will, with this release, propagate that trace context downstream for HTTP and HTTP2 route assertions. Not all the other possible outbound protocols we support, at least with this preview release. We may add context propagation to some or all of those later based on customer demand. But context propagation would allow you in the backend system to see a trace across many different systems that have all played a role in an end-to-end transaction, as long as they're able to respect that context propagation from end to end. We support.
Sorry, yeah. Can I ask, is that going to have quite a large performance hit though on the gateways at all, or should that not make a difference? With respect to performance, so I'll get to that.
Okay. But yeah, nothing comes for free, and yeah, the more you do all of these things, the bigger the performance hit is. But I'll talk about that in a bit.
Okay, thank you.
And so you also can filter what you do trace on, right? So first of all, if you're not going to use it because you don't value, you don't value the observability information you get from OpenTelemetry over the performance impact it has, then you don't need to enable it at all. On startup or using the cluster-wide property that allows you to enable and disable it without restarting. But from a tracing perspective, you can enable metrics, but not traces. And then even if you enable traces, you can further filter it with this cluster, this trace config cluster property on the gateway to only trace certain, transactions of certain services by wildcarded resolution path or GUID. Only trace even those services if the request is accompanied by a specific query parameter. And we're just looking for the name of the query parameter, not a value. And or only trace requests to those services if the request is coming from a specific client IP address. And in this case, we only support one client IP address, not a list of them for this preview release. And you could trace a service, but not trace all of the assertions in the service. So by default, we'll trace every assertion in the service policy. But you could exclude specific assertions, or you could even include specific assertions, and we will only trace what's included, everything by default, or just a subset of that if you explicitly include a list of assertions to trace. And then whatever you put in exclude gets excluded from that. We also can trace changing context variable variables across the policy. But by default, we don't trace context variables. You have to explicitly include context variables. You could include all context variables with a wildcarded asterisk. But of course, that comes with a cost and a risk, because when it comes to context variables, we're not going to do any kind of sensitive data detection and masking. It's basically just too difficult to know, what you're using your context variables for and whether they contain sensitive data. And we're just not going to mask all data by default. So you want to use that judiciously. Also, though we're not deploying and supporting the OpenTelemetry collector, collectors themselves support head and tail sampling, which is a way to not minimize the impact on the gateway because, we're already sending what we will to the collector. So we're already incurring our performance costs, but it definitely is a way to further control what gets distributed to all of your backend systems. Head sampling allows you to take just a sample of the incoming data to the collector without really inspecting that data. So it takes a percentage of your traces, for example, regardless of what characterizes those traces. Tail sampling will actually inspect the data, and it will filter out data based upon conditions it can detect in the data. And then, it can also control where all of that gets sent to multiple backend systems. And then we're also supporting a couple context variables and policy if you want access to that trace context and policy yourself. We'll give you the trace ID and the trace span if there's an active trace happening for that policy. Last but not least, logs. Really the only thing we're doing from an OpenTelemetry perspective for logs is if you have OpenTelemetry and tracing enabled, and you're tracing a service transaction, then the log events that would get generated anyway by the gateway for that service transaction, so all of your other log settings still apply. We will inject the correlation IDs, the context, trace context, if you will, in the form of trace IDs and span IDs into those log messages. The log messages will still go to where they would go based upon your log sync configuration. So it's still your responsibility to, move those logs someplace where they can be useful to a OpenTelemetry backend that wants to correlate between metrics, traces, and logs. But there's lots of ways to do that. Many of you are probably already doing that in some way. Depending on how you've configured your logging, those trace IDs and span IDs might appear in different ways in those different log formats. So here down below, you can see a non-JSON console log. The trace ID -span ID is in this position. Over here in this Grafana view of logs correlated to a trace, If we look really closely, you can see that we've added an OTEL ID property to the JSON log object with a trace ID span ID. So different formats for different types of logs, but it's there to be used. So here's a slide on performance. Our emphasis on this preview release was to make sure we didn't have any negative performance impact on customers in 11.1 with OTEL disabled. The last thing we wanted to do was, include OTEL and suddenly everybody takes a hit, even if they weren't planning to use it. We've otherwise done, pretty light testing to verify that the gateway doesn't just simply explode if you do enable OTEL. Because at the end of the day, everybody's mileage is going to vary from there, right? How have you enabled OTEL to collect how much information across how much traffic, being sent to your services and their policies in your environment? All of that's going to have an impact on the performance of OTEL and then the performance of your gateways when OTEL is enabled. And that's just something we can't measure. So your mileage will vary, but we're very interested in making sure that this is a practical solution for you within reason. And so we want to get your feedback. And depending on the feedback we're getting, we may look at very specific ways to try to optimize OTEL performance for various common scenarios that we're discovering our customers have. Okay. Next features, and I'm going to pick it up a little bit here because we're getting close to the top of the hour. We made some GraphMan enhancements. If you're not familiar with GraphMan by now, you'll want to go out and take a look at it. It's probably one of our earliest progressive delivery features. It's been the most widely adopted one by us for our own purposes, but by many customers too. And because of that, we're constantly enhancing it from PI to PI, release to release, and this represents just more of the same. In this release, we added support for policy revisions. In the process, we genericized policies and services by adding 2 types for them that in turn can have more specific types of policy or service themselves. So we're moving away from the top level specific policies and services that were first introduced with GraphMan to this more generic model. And if you want support for policy revisions, you have to move with that. We're deprecating, but haven't yet removed some of the old specific policy and specific service types in favor of this new approach. We also enhanced GraphMan to support the key certificate management capabilities that you would have for private keys in Policy Manager. In other words, to generate CSRs, have signed CSRs, and then replace certificate chains of private keys with signed certificates. We did that by introducing 3 new mutations that would normally be used together, with the response from one being used as input to the request of another to complete that process. We also enhanced support for identity providers by supporting additional types of identity providers. And in the process, we renamed some of the old types and deprecated but didn't remove the old types themselves. And we did the same for some of their queries and mutations. We also enhanced the way GraphMan does encryptions to use the cluster passphrase for decrypting GraphMan bundle secrets that would be encrypted using the cluster passphrase on startup when bootstrapping those bundles on startup, and changing the header that you would pass a custom passphrase to when exporting bundles, using GraphMan, so that sensitive data in the export bundle is encrypted. And then the intention is that when you configure your container gateways, well, really any gateway, you specify that custom passphrase that you use to encrypt the contents of the bundle in this system property encrypted with the cluster passphrase, such that when that gateway starts up, regardless of its form factor, it's able to use its cluster passphrase, which it would know, to decrypt this Grafman bundle passphrase to use when bootstrapping that bundle that has encrypted content in it using that custom passphrase. We also made creating, encrypting and decrypting secrets using a passphrase OpenSSL friendly, so you could do that at the command line if you want to. Another addition to Grafman that required core gateway changes is what we've been for a while now referring to as policy as code. And there's a lot of excitement around this too, as a way of providing developers and DevOps processes a friendly alternative to authoring policy using Policy Manager. So in other words, a way to author policy outside of Policy Manager. It's supported by Grafman specifically. So the Grafman GraphQL schema now supports specifying the format in which you want policies to be exported together with the definitions of your APIs or fragments. And instead of just supporting an escaped XML string for a single policy property, which has been traditionally the case for RESTman and even Grafman up today, till today, we also now support JSON strings and YAML strings, but perhaps most importantly, a JSON object directly in the JSON definition of the API, making it much easier for a person to work with, without doing anything else. But we did add some embellishments to make it even more easier by shortening some of the names to be more friendly, by removing base 64 encoding of some values for some assertion configuration so that it's easier to just work with as plain text. And we are supporting this automatically for all assertions and all policies out of the box, though some of them may or may not work as well with policy as code because there's so many. But we also don't think it's going to be practically useful for people to create hundreds of assertion long policies using policy as code, right? Policy as code makes it much easier to directly work with policy outside of Policy Manager, but let's be realistic. We're still talking about developers specifying policies of their APIs in JSON for maybe 5, 10, 15, using 5, 10, 15 big building blocks, right? And so for this release, we emphasize support for these 6 assertions, to add comments, to set variables, to be able to pass those variables into encapsulated assertions or policy fragments, and then to be able to wrap all that with conditional and/or logic. And so we would still expect power users of Policy Manager to create more sophisticated policies, abstracted in, encapsulated assertions or policy fragments, and then make those big building blocks available to people that would use policy as code. But then we think that it's very reasonable to expect users to otherwise author their policies outside of Policy Manager just using these 6 assertions and those big building blocks that were created for them. On the left is an example of an XML policy. On the right is an example of its JSON equivalent. So much already JSON, not XML, that's preferred, but also much less. And it also could be embedded in the definition of an API itself, which would be JSON with Grafman. And you'll notice that some of the names have changed to become more friendly than the previous element names were, and that where down here, for example, you see a value is base 64 encoded, here it's in plain text. Throughput quota and assertion enhancements for Redis. This is super exciting because almost everybody uses the throughput quota assertion. And with these enhancements to support sharing, distributing shared throughput quota counters across gateways in the cluster, multiple gateway clusters, clusterless gateways within a region on top of Redis, and with this release specifically within a region, not across regions, and specifically with open source Redis, either deployed as standalone or Sentinel, because we have follow-on work to do in this next PI to deliver cross-region support using active-active enterprise Redis targeting the 11.1 CR1 release. We've seen significantly improved performance and accuracy, near no op performance with 100% accuracy at scale. So no op, high benchmark is the blue. The same no op policy, which is just a return template response and an API in the gateway, with this new throughput quota added to it, is nearly the same level of performance at scale. These other 3 bars down here are every other way we supported doing this before. So it's orders of magnitude better with no leakage and no errors that can't be contributed to something else. Huge improvement. Another new assertion, require an introspect OAuth token assertion. This is going to be an out-of-the-box assertion that can enforce OAuth on your gateways for both opaque and JWT tokens without requiring that you install OTK components on the gateway, but designed to work with our OTK, which itself supports introspection, but also can work with any other industry standard OAuth providers. Key value storage assertion, a single assertion that's going to support both local or distributed key value storage, much like our existing local store and lookup and cache assertions, or our tactical remote cache assertion. Designed to use with local memory or Hazelcast or Redis with this release, could eventually be a replacement for the tactical remote cache assertion over time. Also, in this release, we've advanced all of the capabilities we have been working on for the new WebSockets via shared HTTP port feature to be able to support end-to-end scenarios for that, for which there were a gap that we closed over last year experimentally. We've advanced those experimental gap fillers, if you will, to preview. So this entire feature set's available as preview now. And we made some additional enhancements in 11.1. Couple slides left, deprecations, a couple things we're announcing in this release. We're deprecating but not removing the second duration of the apply throughput quota assertion. It's never really been practically useful just because of the performance of the apply throughput quota assertion with all the other methods we had previously supported for it. As you could see from that performance graph before. And we were getting ready to remove it with the enhancements we're doing until we realized that the new enhanced throughput quota assertion on top of Redis performance went through the roof with excellent accuracy and performance at scale. Hey, maybe, allowing customers to use the second duration is still okay. A big announcement with this release is we're officially announcing support for we're officially deprecating support for X7 and X8 hardware appliances with this gateway version. So this gateway version 11.1 is going to be the last major release that supports hardware appliances at all. And then we'll be announcing the end of life of those models all together at about the same time that we announce the end of life of 11.1, which would be approximately 3 years from its release. So the announcement will go out approximately 18 months before that. So if you're a hardware appliance customer or you work with hardware appliance customers, it's really important to start thinking about getting off those hardware appliance form factors to any of the other form factors we still support, the virtual appliances, software gateways, or container gateways. Valid upgrade paths for software and container gateways. It's generally a standard upgrade for both. But for the software gateways, you do need to first install JDK 17 on the software gateway host. You don't have to, but you should get the latest version of the new patch management service that was built for JDK 17. And then you just follow the standard upgrade process. For appliance gateways, we will support going from 10x to 11.1, but you'll have to follow the manual expedited upgrade process because you're also going from CentOS 7 to Debian 12 at the same time. If you've already done that to get to 11.0, then this is when we support the in-place upgrade for 11.0 to 11.1. We talked about that earlier. If you want, you could still do a manual expedited upgrade. Some customers are going to have their reasons for preferring that way of upgrading over in place. Again, no new 11.1 ISO for hardware appliances. If you're on hardware and you do want to go to 11.1 before you move off it altogether, then you'll first need to use the 11.0 ISO to get to 11.0, and then you would perform the in-place upgrade on those hardware appliances to go from 11.0 to 11.1. I know we're 2 minutes over. Bear with me. This is my last slide. A couple other things we want you to know about. There are other known issues that are being documented with this release, like there are usually some known issues with every release. Just make sure you read the documentation. You'll find those under the release notes in the 11.1 tech docs. We are also announcing a new gateway versioning and upgrade strategy with this release. It'll first take effect with what would have been 11.1 CR1, which we're currently targeting for end of July of this year. Essentially, we're getting rid of CRs, and we're going to use the subminor version to represent them instead. So for what would have been 11.1 CR1 at the end of July, that will get released as 11.1.01. Now, this is only going to apply to 11.1 going forward. 11.0, which will continue to have some CR releases until it goes into life, is still going to use CRs for those purposes until then. Why are we doing this? Well, one, it just aligns us better with Broadcom's preferred software versioning model. Well, industry standards and Broadcom's preferred software versioning model. We were a bit of an outlier with our CR approach, and that's going to have benefits for us within Broadcom. But for customers, it should benefit you because it's otherwise going to give us an opportunity to change our upgrade processes, to expect database upgrades for subminor releases, and possibly platform upgrades for subminor releases. Two things we tried to avoid doing outside of major releases, which created artificial limitations on the way we designed and released features. Sometimes we would bend over backwards to design a feature in a way where it didn't require a database schema change in order to get it out in a CR release. Sometimes we had to make database schema changes, or we had to perform platform updates, and we had to hold those things back until the next major release. We're trying to remove those limitations so we can use all of these releases largely the way we have been using them for years, but without those limitations. And then lastly, I just want to throw out there that we announced the Layer7 operator back in February 12th. It's a separate component that can deploy and manage container gateways in Kubernetes, but it's also being extended to integrate with the portal in a variety of ways. So it's kind of a component unto itself, not directly tied to the gateway, not released at the same time as the gateway, but it was released recently and we're just trying to get the word out. So if you're not familiar with the Layer7 operator, just know that it's also been released as preview. It's ready to be used by customers in production environments if they request approval. It's a new and arguably better way, depending on how you want to manage your gateways with or without a database, to deploy container gateways to Kubernetes. And that is it for the presentation. So I'm just going to take a quick glance at the chat. We'll work my way from the bottom up. Yes, we will publish the presentation with the recording. Usually Bill Oakes will post that to the Layer7 community after this. And then we would send out another support portal announcements with links to that after this. Does this metrics will be available in the portal? Yes, I believe Greg has roadmap to also support open telemetry in different ways with the portal too, but Greg, I'll let you speak to that.
That'll be a little more futuristic right now. Like we're looking at portal better providing telemetry, not necessarily consuming the OTel data, right? But yeah, that's something we're always looking at going forward, and no promises or no idea of timing at this point, but it is something we're looking at.
Thank you. And then will the agent be included in the software appliance? No, we're not including the open telemetry agent with any of our gateway form factors. We are only including the SDK in all of our form factors, and the SDK is the only thing you need to get the out-of-the-box open telemetry that we support that's specific to the gateway. We're guiding you on how you could optionally deploy the open telemetry agent together with your gateways to get more information from the tech stack that the gateway is built on top of that would be relevant to the gateway, but it'll still be up to the individual customer to decide they want to do that and then to deploy and use that correctly. Is MySQL with IONODB cluster configuration also supported? Honestly, I don't know the answer to that question. Certainly not with MySQL standard. That might just be the way MySQL Enterprise works and with group replication, but I don't know if there's not a distinction there. We did nothing new specific to IONODB support, certainly with the MySQL standard that we include. And it might be transparent to us behind the proxy that you would have to deploy in front of MySQL Enterprise with or without group replication. That I don't know. Another question from Tal. When will OTel and Redis quota features be GA? So we don't really publicize any GA dates for any of the progressive delivery features, even the ones that got advanced to preview. Normally, until we've got enough customers using those preview features, providing feedback, indicating demand that would have us prioritize advancing them from preview to GA. At which point, then there would be a GA feature on our backlog that we'd be planning in a PI targeting a specific release. That has not yet happened for any of those progressive delivery features. The first feature that would probably happen for would be GraphMan. It's one of the earliest and most widely adopted, and we're going to start take a closer look at when we want to advance that to GA. And then you'll start to see a more specific indication of when that will happen for GraphMan in our roadmap presentations and otherwise. But as yet, nothing for OTel or Redis. However, again, if you have a production use case for those and they work the way you want them to right now as preview, then you could go to production. You could ask, you can go to production with them if you want without asking us to support your use of those in production. That's really up to you and your risk acceptance. But if you want us to support your use of those preview features in production, we are able to do that within limits. We can't do it for everybody. That's what GA is for, but we can do it for a handful of early adopters if they request approval, and those features and their expectations of those features and our ability to support their use of those features all align. So we have you submit a request to Broadcom support to get approved. We have a conversation, and if we approve you, we track you as a customer that has our support for using those features in production, and that would unblock any related support cases you might open. Great. Anybody else have any more questions?
Yeah, Ben, Greg here from USDA. I put a question about end of support dates, but I really have a two-parter, and it coincides with end of support and the current release strategy for version 11 in terms of OpenJDK. So I'm constantly under stress at a government level for security from vulnerability. And OpenJDK for this product is only getting released like once, twice, maybe 3 times a year. I guess what I'm asking is, there's going to be future CRs of version 11. I have to assume that OpenJDK is going to be upgraded as part of that in the near future. I would like to know, because I get a differing opinion as far as like the long-term support for Debian 11, as I see it as being like almost not developer supported, but like community supported until June of 2026. Is that like the tentative end of support for version 11 on Bullseye?
Yeah, so a lot there. We try to take it from the top, a reminder. So in general, our major releases have a 3-year lifetime from the day they were released. Recently, with 11.1, we're trying to do 3 years and 3 months so that we overlap the latest major release with the oldest supported major release by 3 months if we can. We slipped to 2 months with 11.1 to give some customers a window of opportunity to skip a release when upgrading. But in general, it's approximately 3 years. So 11 was released January of last year, so its end of life would be January of 2026. From a OpenJDK perspective, it was going to go end of life in October of this year, and that was one of the motivations for upgrading to JDK 17 and 11.1 was to have a gateway version that would have a supported JDK version beyond that. But then they ended up extending it to, I think, 2027, like we thought they might, but it took them forever to do. So we had already started the upgrade process, which is not a bad thing for us to do anyway. We're already looking out to JDK 21. From a Debian perspective, similar. They have like a extended support period for their versions, and I think Debian 11 should go out to, if I'm not mistaken, it's something like October, November, December of 2026. I don't remember at the top of my head, but it just came up recently, and 11.1 should be end of life before Debian 11 is end of life, so we should be good there. And of course, 11.1 is already on Debian 12, which will take us beyond the end of life of 11.1. Now, we do only officially support Adoptium's Tamirin OpenJDK. However, we've had other customers use other OpenJDKs, in particular RHEL OpenJDK, and at least some of those customers are government customers, and some of them have to also install our software gateways on FIPS-enabled operating systems using RHEL OpenJDK. Again, a combination we haven't officially supported, but you and those customers are important to us. So we've been doing some work over the last PIs and going into this next PI to unblock customers from installing our software gateways on FIPS-enabled operating systems using the RHEL OpenJDK, if that's their requirement. But we got to kind of take that case by case, and we can't just say we'll support any OpenJDK because they don't all behave the same way. For example, RHEL OpenJDK behaves very differently when the operating system is FIPS enabled than the Tamirin OpenJDK does.
Okay, I'm sorry. I should have mentioned before. I'm using the virtual appliance, ISO provided by Broadcom. So
okay,
I guess what I'm trying to find out is there going to be an OpenJDK upgrade for the current version 11?
There'll be minor version upgrades.
Minor. Yes, that's exactly what I'm asking. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll continue to look at that from release to release. So for 11.0, for its CR releases, we'll continue to look at minor JDK 11 upgrades to it until it goes to end of life.
Okay, thank you.
Ben, I have a couple of questions. One is we are using container gateway, the Docker image of API gateway. So what is the underlying JDK version of container gateway version 11.1?
So JDK versions are the same across gateway form factors. So for 11.1 container gateway, it's also getting the JDK 17 upgrade.
Okay, because we don't explicitly install the JDK, right? It is all bundled together with the Docker image. That's why I'm explicitly asking that.
Right.
Okay. The second question is, I'm not sure if I have misunderstood it. So we are currently using 10.1 version of API gateway container form factor again. So we are in the process of upgrading to 11.1 version. So can we directly jump from 10.1 to 11.1 version of API gateway upgrade, or do you have to go through in between versions?
You can.
I can, correct?
Yeah. You would just do that by changing your tags to the later versions, and
Yeah.
the container gateway, unlike our other form factors, will automatically do the database upgrade on startup if it detects it's required.
Got it. Yeah, that's my follow-up question. Thank you for clarifying
From
that.
those versions, though, I would not expect a rolling update.
That's
I
fine.
would
That's fine. I have
scale
read that
down
point,
to
which is okay. We can take a little bit of outage there.
yeah, I'd scale down to 0 and then scale back up.
Got it. Yeah. Thank you, Ben. That is it from me.
Yeah, you bet. Any other questions, folks? All right. Well, thanks for staying along. And yes, this recording and the slides should be shared soon on our community portal and through a support portal announcement soon. All right. Have a good day, guys.
Thanks, everyone.